Hey Majors! When I was growing up, I loved watching a show called Handy Manny. Handy Manny was the story of a town's local handyman named Manny and his toolbox of magical talking tools. Manny would go around the town with his toolbox of tools and he'd help all of his friends and neighbors with any issues they ran into with plumbing or electrical or anything you could think of around their businesses or their homes. And one of his magical talking tools was a hammer named Pat. Now Pat was a good hammer, as hammers go, but Pat ran into an issue one day. One day Pat fell and hit his head a little too hard, and Pat forgot he was a hammer. When he woke up, he thought he was a screwdriver, and he was so utterly convinced that he was a screwdriver that he wouldn't let Manny use him as a hammer anymore. He was worried that if he got hit against something, that he would get hurt, so when Manny would go to tap in a nail, Manny couldn't use the tool he needed because Pat was afraid. Now, I remember seeing this and thinking, that's so silly, right? It's so ridiculous because the thing that Pat is really afraid of is being used for the thing he was really made to do. And I remember thinking, how dumb do you have to be afraid of the very thing that you were made for? But as I grew up, I started to realize more and more that I could be Pat the Hammer sometimes, that I would find things that God had called me to that were good things, but that I wanted to run away from because they were scary. Maybe you find yourself in a similar boat. There are good things God's called you to, but they look hard, and it's hard to tell if you're really the man or woman for the job. What does the Bible have to say about this? Well, in Judges chapter 6, we meet a man named Gideon. We don't see anything about Gideon that makes him particularly remarkable. He's from one of the lesser respected tribes of Israel. Within that tribe, his family is not necessarily the most respected, and his dad is somewhat of a leader in the community, but Gideon's not. Instead, when we meet Gideon, Gideon is threshing wheat in a wine press. This is notably not the place where Gideon is supposed to be threshing out the wheat. But he's afraid to thresh wheat in the field because he's afraid that his nation's enemies will see him threshing wheat and take the wheat and possibly even hurt him. See, at this time, Gideon's people are being oppressed by another people called Midian. But God shows up. The angel of the Lord calls out to Gideon while he's in the midst of threshing wheat in the wine press and says, "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." Now, nothing Gideon has done yet makes us look at him and say, wow, there is a mighty man of valor. Yet God looks on him and calls him that anyway. The truth is, God has similar things to say about you. God called you by name. He saved you, and he calls you son or daughter. He doesn't look at the places where you failed and say, that one's unremarkable. Instead, he considers you so precious, he considered you worth dying for. You don't need me to share the gospel with you. You already know Jesus. But the truth is, sometimes we don't live like we believe these things to be true. Sometimes we act like Pat the Hammer. We act like we've fallen and forgotten who we are, and we forget the identity that we have in God. The question is, are you willing to lay down your idea of who you are and replace it with who God says you are? If we did that, just imagine what our families, churches, and communities would look like. Not self-righteous people, not falsely humble people, and not people crippled by our own insecurities, but people who are willing to face challenges with confidence, not because of faith in our own abilities, but because of faith in who God says he is and who he has called us to be. This is the position Gideon is going to find himself in next week as we continue examining the topic of identity. I'm glad you could share this moment with me, and I'll see you next week, Majors.